We're beginning the season of Advent, which is the part of the church calendar that we celebrate where God breaks into the physical world. It's the first coming that we get to reimagine what life can be like as we move towards the second coming. This season, we want to imagine this through a subset of the Greek Orthodox that moves through Advent through the lenses of the angels, the shepherds, the magi's, and the prophets, where we'll sit within their stories of Jesus coming to say, what would it look like for us to anticipate the next?
So today we'll sit with a passage in Luke 2:10 through 14. The angel said, "Don't be afraid. Look, I bring good news to you, wonderful, joyous news for all people. Your Savior is born today in David's city. He is Christ the Lord. This is a sign for you. You will find a newborn baby wrapped snugly and lying in a manger." Suddenly a great assembly of the heavenly forces was with the angel praising God. They said, "Glory to God in heaven, and on earth peace among those whom he favors."
This is an interesting way for us to be able to step into Advent, because most of the time we want to focus on Jesus and some of the things Jesus brought. So the faith, hope, and love. We don't look at the other characters that really inform the story. So as we enter into Advent and the coming, we get to consider first the messengers of God. It actually sets a different tone for how we get to imagine what it looks like to tell the Christmas story.
Yeah, and I find it interesting that it looks, like having those different perspectives and telling the narrative from those different perspectives allows us to see something different, where we tend to use these characters as props in the backstory and solely focus on Jesus. By actually showing up and having them show up in the story and tell us what their perspective of the story is, I think is a really great way for us to walk through this, and will hopefully offer up some new insights and new ways for us to be able to look at the Christmas and Advent narrative together.
That's good. I just, as you were talking, I realized, that's so right. Jesus is a baby. He can't really do much. And there's a lot of adults in this story that, and some pretty crazy things are happening. And I think to be able to actually spend time to see their perspective and their eyes and their voice, both the vocal and the silent characters, I think will give us a new sense of what it means to be expectant for the coming of Christ to come.
And with what you said, you're right, because I think so often, I think Christians need to get comfortable being critiqued by everyone, because that way of reading that you just described reminds me so much of Talladega Nights, the old comedy. Because it seems like around these scenes, we go through these elaborate things that I like 9-pound, 6-ounce baby Jesus learning his shapes and colors. And we never want to get to the expanding full characters that actually give meaning, depth, purpose. That Jesus is important. It kind of is his story throughout the Gospels, but that we want to be careful not to turn down or to take over all the voices surrounding the development.
Yeah, that's good. And so, yeah, so today, we want to just talk about angels. We talked about, as Glenn called it, angels in the outfield, which I loved as a great way to walk into that. So moving from that one passage where we have, truthfully, what is at least in the tradition I grew up in, it was never an army. It was basically a choir. It was Jesus' heavenly choir announcing, "Baby boy," kind of idea.
It was Sister Act 2. It was always done like Sister Act 2.
Not in my tradition, nor my imagination. Oh. It was always very white, German-esque, choral,
like the Queen's coronation type
exactly
of deal.
That kind of stuff. Yeah. Those are the images that shaped my imagination growing up, man. If it was like Sister Act, then it'd be that's kind of dope though. You know what I mean? As long as you got Whoopi in there, leading it, this could, Jesus could be fire.
Not something you should be afraid of. You wouldn't be afraid of the Sister Act choir. Maybe the Queen's coronation choir would be a little unsettling.
Yeah. Well, and to be fair, like the images that we're given of all of these characters, even like of angels, is never something to actually be afraid of, right? It's like precious moments,
Mm.
angels, and precious moment Jesus. And it's like when they say, "Do not be afraid," it's like I think they put the wrong words there. It's like, "Do not be in awe of such cuteness."
do not pinch, do not pinch the cheeks of the angel.
Exactly. Right? Like, yeah, and those are those are the images that we're given, right? Like it's the precious moments choir showing up and announcing precious moments Jesus, and everybody says ah. But I know one of the aspects that we wanted to kind of touch on today is even looking at it from that different notion that one angels showing up. This is heaven's liberation force. This is heaven's army showing up. This isn't just precious moments, you know. I mean, angels. It's not even a cute and cuddly story, even though there's a cute and cuddly little baby in the middle of it. Oh, Jesus might have been ugly, but you know what I'm saying.
Well, just it's newborn. Like there's no such thing as an attractive newborn baby.
And every mother just turns you off, homie. Every mother.
Yeah, but they didn't disagree with me. They just said that's mean, not inaccurate.
So we do not endorse anybody's opinions or views on this show. Their views and opinions are strictly their own, and you can't sue us for anything that Glenn says.
But with what you said, though, getting back to the point of the heaven's liberation force, it also goes with seeing them as cute, cuddly angels, and we see this as kind of almost Cupid-esque from the Romantic period of painting. It changes the way we hear the good news being brought, because so often we say the angels brought good news, but not good news for this world. The angels brought good news, but it's not something that will be tangible, real. So when it talks about thrones being turned over, the poor and disadvantaged being raised up, the rich leaving with empty hands, where the poor and the humble leave with full bellies, we're like, oh yeah, those are all spiritual things. So when the good news comes, which is the same language that if anyone's ever heard Carl talk about empire critique before, it's the same language that Caesar would use to announce military victories. It's the good news of the conquering empire that you are now so lucky to have our armies in your land. Mm-hmm. When that happens, you now have the angelic force coming into those on the edges of society and saying, you're about to have the expected heavenly host arrive. The only big switch we have is it's not going to bring on earth the way they thought it would be brought, that there's going to be a spreading of the table rather than a reinforcing of the walls.
Yeah, I think that's really good. As we were talking about this before the recording, I think what really struck me was that piece that um, the angels appearing are a sign of God's army, so to speak. But typically, especially in that world, in the world of the Bible, an army meant violence, army meant bloodshed, army meant destruction of people, cultures, everything you knew and loved. But with this army, with this force, the first instruction or announcement that's given is do not be afraid. And I think that it's important to note that this army, even though people in who would be receiving the announcement from the angels would kind of hope or expect there to be some sort of violent overthrow, this army um, isn't ushering in their liberation through violence. They're ushering it in through an announcement of do not fear, that there is a reason to be hopeful, that there is a reason to be joyful, that there is good news. There's something good to look forward to. And I think that's a really important message for us today, even just thinking of how many of uh, our images and even the way we treat each other sometimes, or Christians treat other communities today, there's this expectation or longing for violence sometimes. But if we look at even the way that these powerful, fearsome angels are appearing, they're appearing in a way that brings peace. And their announcement is one of peace. And I think that was a really important thing for me to note as we were going through this passage.
No, that's good. And just even like one thing another just a thought that I find really interesting is that we have a people, what this announcement is being made to, that have been waiting for their liberation army to show up, right? Like they've been waiting for the kingdom of God, for like to use that language, to show up and liberate them, because they since exile they've had one army after another basically roll up, one empire after another roll up, and then begin to dictate the terms of their existence. And their whole idea of, it's like the coming of God, the coming of the Messiah, the coming of Christ was all about being liberated from that cycle of violence, being liberated from that cycle of being crushed by empires, when they would be the top dog again, when they would be the empire again, when they would basically see kind of like Solomon-esque glory return to Israel, right? So when the temple was at its most beautiful and all of that kind of stuff, which is why like when you have like kings like King Herod and stuff, they go on these temple building projects in order to beautify the temple, in order to lay claim to that historic notion of what the Messiah was supposed to be doing. And then you have a baby that is born on the outskirts of power, on the outskirts of the capital, on the outskirts of the city. And when the angels show up, they're announcing this good news, again, not to the rich and powerful, not to the people who have already laid claim to being a Messiah type character, but they are doing it in the way, I think, like Glenn had said it when we were talking about before, any siege army showing up, you know what I mean, laying siege to a city, even if it's a liberation force, the people who would know about it first would be the shepherds, the outsiders, the ones on the outskirts of the city. But these people are also Jesus's people. This is also where Jesus is present. Jesus is born in a shepherd town, right? That is on the outskirts of power.
Mm. And I like when we step into these and we imagine what it is to talk about the angels, and specifically why did, like Megan said earlier, like, why did we necessitate angels to come rather than God shows up throughout Scripture? This seems to be kind of a big event, incarnation and all that. So you think God might, make an appearance. But if we look at it in some of that kind of metaphor of the warfare, then the king never goes first. You have representatives of kingship go first. You would have the army go first. And for us to make sure that we don't make it intangible, because often we see these things, and because it's not our thought world, we spiritualize them all and either make really good futures that we hope happen someday magically past the physical world, or we use this as to say we just suffer in silence and eventually these kind of armies will show up for us. It's that they saw it and some of the prophetic utterances building to that scene, that it says what we see now is the compassionate mercy of our God shining upon us like morning sun, like dawn breaking over the mountains. So whatever it is to announce that this is an army showing up, these are the angels showing up in a way we didn't expect, for the people we didn't expect, in order to build a world that we couldn't see coming. If we talk about this, that the world is darker now, that we're waiting for the world to fall apart for God to return, that the second advent is because we think the sun is setting instead of rising, then we actually started to adopt a Gnostic way of seeing God's actions. We think there's a spiritual plane removed from us that can't be a part of us, that the physical world has to just get dark enough for the second advent to happen, for the second coming. But at least for the imagination of Luke with the armies, you don't ransom, you don't redeem a group multiple times. When the army's coming in, they redeem them, they ransom them, they rescue or save them. And they're like, okay, now we can set up the freedom of the city. And that is the sunrise going. So I think this reminds us, the angels coming remind us that this must be a tangible, this world lived experience, not an ethereal, abstract, Gnostic, well, maybe one day when we're no longer physical, we'll see something.
That's good. like as you're describing that, especially when you talked about the sunrise part, you know what I mean? Like I can't help but think of like Lord of the Rings, like the scene from the Two Towers, where the whole time like salvation comes from looking over the horizon, in a sense. You know what I mean? So, as salvation comes from a distance, and in a very tangible, like real, well, it's Lord of the Rings, so when I say real world force, you get what I'm saying. But there's that notion of looking for salvation on the horizon, right? And this is a group of people that have been looking for salvation on the horizon, and instead of showing up like it shows up with a heavenly army in one sense, but at the same time, for me at least, I feel like the authors are writing into the narrative. They're adding meaning to the birth of Christ, not necessarily saying like these are like real events that happen per se, right? Like I'm not trying to say that there wasn't angels that showed up or anything like that, but that notion that like you have this heavenly host in a field announcing the arrival of the king. It's more to give context to the reader to say, oh, that's what this birth means. This birth is about the liberation of the people of God. This birth is about the liberation of humanity. This birth is about the liberation from empire.
I like what you were sharing, Glenn, and I'm just mulling over it a little bit. But I think that it's interesting too to kind of just see some movements in at least the even just the couple of first chapters of Luke, and there is this movement of focusing on the physical world and the tangible. You see, even just with the incarnation of Christ, it's we have our God who is spirit becoming human flesh. We have these angels revealing themselves in a physical way, moving into this physical realm to say like, hey, this world, the world that you can see and feel and experience with your senses, that is the one that's worth paying attention to in this moment. That is what is getting liberated. um, I think there is this we do have this tendency to want to just expect some other spiritual reality to happen and come when um, in this story of the birth of Christ and all of the uh, visitations of from angels that surround it. It's this movement to valuing what's happening here on earth right now, and that the expectation of what we have to come is what's going to happen here in the real world. And I think that the announcements of angels kind of bring more meaning to our physical reality in that way. And that's what Advent does as well. It brings us into this expectation that our real world is going to change, and not in a way where it gets scrapped and thrown out, but in a way where the meaning and beauty of it is preserved, if that makes sense.
I like it, at least what I'm hearing in it is the announcement of the angels adds depth to life, not escape from life.
Mm. Yeah.
And in that, it draws us more into a tangible reality. Like you said, the whole narrative, you have the barren old couple that has a child. Then as Jesus is born, is being, or just after born, you have shepherds in the field coming in. They go and they still have them circumcised and do sacrifices. Like nothing draws them away from the actual physicality of life.
Mm.
It gives greater depth, greater meaning, and a hope for what to move towards. It gives a movement to join, but not a reason to become passive and say we can wait until the end.
So, and it's interesting that, like, culturally, when we look at Advent, when we look at like Christmas as a season, like honestly, as a holiday, it has kind of become this great, like, consumeristic escapist holiday, right? Like it's really about drowning ourselves in eggnog and gifts that we don't need, things that we don't need. it's as much as like these are actual tangible things, but reality is it takes us away from our everyday lives per se, right? Like, so we think of this Advent season as or as a holiday, as an escape, as a vacation from our everyday lives, where, how do I put it, like at least the way that when I'm reflecting on what we're talking about today, and I'm hearing this narrative, there's actually almost a reversal of that. It's actually, let's move deeper into the reality of this world. Let's move deeper into the things, instead of allowing consumerism to overtake us. This is actually a rejection of these things that actually pull us away from living our lives in sincere and real and meaningful ways that bring about liberation and equity and hope, or to use the other language from Advent, love, peace, joy, and hope. You know what I mean? Christmas, then, in that sense, like, even the language around that, I think, is a call to remember who we are, and also like in a sense, like, what is, like, that the coming of Christ, first Advent and second Advent, is about bringing something tangible into this world, not about taking us out of this world, right? It's not about us escaping this world. And it'd be interesting, just if even as a culture we began to reimagine what celebration then looks like in anticipation of that.
I really like what you're saying there, for sake of, this whole movement away from physicality. We can use a lot of methods for it. So gifts and material goods, it can be something that's for need or to help something advance or to draw closer, but it can just be a numbing agent. When they talk about retail shop therapy, or we've all known people who use wine to have a celebration, or to use wine so they don't have to feel the end of the day. Like, it's about what the material brings you into. Does it draw you towards, does it allow you to experience more? Or are you using it as a numbing agent to say, I can, whatever this hollowness is, I can gloss over it for a moment? And we use holy days for that all the time. It's like we can ignore our lived experience, our relationships, our family, our social location, the people around us, our communities, and we'll draw in and hide from it for now, rather than be pushed out into what it means to be more locally rooted and connected.
I also think that's a great way to sort of bring it into just our current um, very real and present reality. I think there is escapism is something we definitely, I think, lean towards in this time. Many of us as a culture as a whole, but I think the experience of hope cannot be felt when you're numb. And I think we when we continually numb ourselves in this way, and sometimes that numbness can look like over spiritualizing. I feel like constantly pointing to some spiritual reality that's uh, so separated from what's actually happening in this world. I think is just a way to sort of put your blinders on and numb yourself from just problems that seem too big, too hard, and you being just one individual that can't do anything about it. Um, and that numbness, I think, is really what's going to get in the way of you experiencing hope in the way that the angels in this story wanted their audience to feel hope. Hope that was uh, fearsome at first, but once the reality started to sink in of all the different ways that this could change the future, that hope would be much more deep rooted, would be life changing. It would turn your life upside down. And I don't know about anybody else listening to this, but I feel like I'm still waiting to feel what it means to experience hope that feels like it turned my life upside down. in a way where I was no longer numb, but was truly excited and um, uh, truly in a state of awe for the potential of a new reality. So I think in working in the tradition of the announcement of angels, it's important to look at the ways and evaluate the ways we are numbing ourselves as Christians, as humans, and how that is interfering with our ability to experience the true hope of Advent.
Um, I really enjoy the way you're asking to be drawn towards that hope. And for the passage we're looking at today, um, it just it this is the part that shocks me. Sorry. And I wonder how this affects just within our traditions, because often when we talk about hope, we talk about disembodied hope. So we have a hope that things will turn out, not a hope that we need to lean in. And in 10, when it says there's this good news of great joy, goes down to 12 and says, but to experience this, you need to go to a poor person's house. So yes, there's this is the advancing of God's army is coming, breaking into this world. Like I said, he uses the metaphor, like the breaking of dawn over the mountaintops. You can see light is coming. But if you need to go experience this light, you want to know where it is. It's in the neighborhood next to you. Can you go see the one wrapped in a blanket in a manger with animals? And it calls us into more physicality, more embodiment. They didn't go on a retreat. They weren't told to go to a mountaintop. They were told to leave the field and go into somebody's house. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the draw that we often miss in these times, is when we do those movements of spiritualizing and numbing ourselves, like you said. I think spiritual practices can numb us just like anything else, because we don't have to lean into where our actual life is rooted. And we see the movement of the angels drew attention to where life is rooted around them and said, hope is in your neighbor's house.
It's interesting. Just something as I'm thinking, like just even the language that we're choosing to use as we're talking about this around like spiritual and real and language like that, tangible. Like we are functioning from like a dualistic kind of expectation in a sense of what reality is. There's a spiritual reality, there's a tangible physical reality in a sense. And I wonder if this story, like, again, I don't know if this is, I have no idea if this is anything about what the original author's intent or anything like that. I couldn't really care less about that, truthfully. But if this story in this moment is actually calling us to say, maybe there isn't two realities. Maybe your like this spiritual reality that you've been chasing after, using to numb yourselves, is a false hope. That hope is found in embracing the tangible, the here, the now, and learning how to be present in ways that we can see the heavenly host. So we can see that in a baby, there is a liberation force, that where we can see, like these things that we're looking for, and they show up in different ways because we've been looking for a spiritual salvation per se, but they show up in real world, flesh and blood, poopy diapers kind of idea. Like they're here in the flesh and blood, if that makes sense, right? Like I'm just like, because I'm listening to the language that we're using, and I'm like, like I wonder if this story is actually calling us away from that. I wonder if this story is trying to shape our imaginations in a way that says we're looking for something spiritual, and the spiritual shows up in the flesh and blood.
That's so good. I think, like, as you were talking, I was wondering, like, oh gosh, I have all my Western world biases really at play in this conversation. And there is a danger, I think, in completely just creating these two sides of the spectrum. Well, you have physical and spiritual, and then whatever side you lean on, being one is bad, one is good. And it's not that we want to say that the certain way of approaching the world with a priority for the spiritual is necessarily bad, but I think it's about redefining what spiritual is, and that they're way more way more the same maybe than we tend to divide it, and it being the same experience, seen in different ways. And I like how Glenn was noticing that movement of, from the heavenly host, sending the shepherds to a living room, essentially, that you can that the number one, I don't want to use the word agenda, but that the God's messengers is essentially saying, the biggest thing that's happening in God's kingdom right now is in someone's living room, in this birth that's happening. And I think that's a really important way for us to watch how what's happening in a spiritual way is being redefined, as something that's, you cannot divorce it from the tangible, from the real world, and that the Messiah is being ushered in a small living room. That this is, one, something that's in the real world, and then one, something that's with, the normal people, the people who are suffering, the people who, are disadvantaged, and it's going to show up and pop up in those places.
And I really appreciate the notion of the birth narratives, just for one big reason. We see at the end of the Gospels, it said Jesus hides a lot, because like, oh, you're the messianic figure. Awesome. When are we going to get like a military base around you? He's like, oh, shoot, that's not what I'm doing. And it even shows a lot of time with his disciples that they didn't get it. They got a sword. He got upset. That you see in this point that when God breaks into the world, it's in a form that cannot be militarized. No one can get an infant child and be like, okay, I'm going to put you on a war horse. Lead us into battle. That would be really weird and awkward. So the one way that we see the new, that we see the spiritual reality, not coming into, like Carl said, we don't want to make it a dualism, but being revealed in the tangible, is through something that you could not use for power. Even the shepherds had to go to and see something that had to be taken care of, and said, this is how God's coming into the world, as an object that first must be cared for, rather than, as Matthew would say, an angel of the Lord standing there to, like, okay, cool, you're already suited up, we got this. Like, God came as an object of care first and said, this is how the new is coming in.
Throughout scripture, you can see continuing stories that have the motif of power reversal. And I think that happens in the Old Testament. It's happening in the Gospels. It's happening with the arrival and life of Jesus. But I think with the arrival of angels, that's also true in terms of, even with the Passover story. The arrival of angels was the sort of final step of the power reversal that was happening with those who were enslaved in Egypt. And I think there was this expectation that with the arrival of these new angels, or just in this new story, that there would be a power reversal, and there was. It wasn't the way we normally see power reversal, where the power gets transferred. So the people who don't have it now have the power to oppress someone else, to overthrow someone else. But this power reversal is one of self-emptying, of releasing the power, not trying to grab onto it and have the ability to now be violent over someone else in the way that you're safe. But it's a power reversal that allows us to value life in a new way, and not one that's being ushered in by violence and fear, but of valuing life in a way that we are bringing and keeping peace.